Greetings, I'm Dr. Eric Berg, Professor of Philosophy at MacMurray College, and for this Mac Talk, I'm going to be talking with you about a very appropriate text for our time, Albert Camus' novel, The Plague. I've taught at MacMurray for just south of 15 years, and for the most part, my area of specialization has been 20th century French philosophy, and particularly Camus. So here's the book, titled The Plague by Camus. This is a trade edition, easily found, easily located, that one. In French, of course, the text is titled La Peste. It was originally published in 1947 by Gallimard Publishing House, which is the premium publishing house in France. It was his second novel that he produced for them and became extraordinarily famous in France in the 40s and 50s. And his reputation endures then beyond his death. The English version of this text was published in 1948 for the first time. A couple spoiler alerts. So if you see that this talk is about the plague and you want to read it first and then watch it, that's great. Or if you want to use this chat as a entree into the text so you can read it and get a little more out of it, that's a perfect deal too. But I just want to let you know a little bit of a spoiler alert on that. So the opening of the text starts in an unusual way. Strong opening lines, which is a trademark of Camus. The text opens with the date 1904 underscore. So the text is gonna be placed somewhere in the 1940s. It's a text that's read on 4 levels. So there's 4 really enjoyable, well thought out, well constructed levels to this text, which is one of the reasons that it's so appropriate to assign in a philosophy class and so widely read yet today. So number 1, the first level that this text operates on is that it is a story about plague. So that's what makes it particularly appropriate to be reading right now. It's about a small town, or not small town, medium-sized town in North Africa in the 40s, Oran in Algeria, that acquires bubonic plague. So it goes about its business. It sort of focuses on the doctor and explores all these different avenues around the city of people experiencing plague and what's going on. So you're going to see an enormous amount of parallels with the daily occurrences here. It's hard for me to go through an entire news story and not recall something in the plague that's very similar to what's happening today. The second level that this text operates on is that it's a metaphor for World War II. So Oran is France, and the infestation, of course, that settles in on France in the 1940s is the German political and military machine. Rats come to Oran. The fleas move from rats to cats to dogs to humans. Plague moves by way of rats, cats, dogs, and onto humans, and it infects the entire city. Stock characters are used then in the text to represent segments of the population in France, in occupied France. So you have the religious community, their reaction to the German occupation and invasion of France. You have the government, of course, illuminated quite well. You have the medical community illuminated quite well, and you have the resistance fighters that are done quite well inside the text. So the second level is you can read it, and you can also be thinking about at the same time your knowledge of France during World War II and how those parallels work so well together. The third level that the text is written on is it's a really good narrative about politics, social political philosophy, and the human nature. So it heavily explores the political relationships that are set up in a time of plague, or in a time of invasion, or in a time when there's enormous pressure placed on a government or a government collapses. Politics is the distribution of goods, material goods like medicine and money and hospital beds, etc., ventilators, like we know. It's also justice. It's something that the government distributes in a political system. Who gets a ventilator, who doesn't? For instance, there's a material issue there. There's also a philosophical issue moral issue at that piece. So the plague, the text does a wonderful job of talking about lifetime during that particular infestation or that German invasion or plague itself. It also does a wonderful job talking about the social relations that develop and break down in plague situation. And the fourth, is a metaphysical narrative here. You get a really, really good accounting of the nature of evil and descriptions and reactions to evil and what that means to these different groups and how they react to it, etc. So you've got this very high philosophical meaning, philosophical narrative that's running inside this story of the metaphysical nature of evil. And then in the third level, to back up, you've got politics, social political narrative that goes on there. Camus does a wonderful job of exploring politics and social philosophy. World War II, it's a beautiful metaphor, and then it's just an extraordinarily well-written text on these people that suffer plague and Oran. I'll have a few notes on Camus. He's an extraordinarily interesting person. I don't know if he's terribly likable. Jury's still out on that with me, and I've spent a lot of time with Camus, but he's really interesting, nevertheless. Born in Algeria in 1913, very poor family. French descent, but born in Algeria. That is a really deep impact on Camus because he constantly straddles these two worlds. Is he Algerian? Well, the French think he is. Is he French? Well, the Algerians think he is. He's never really firmly planted on either side of that. He's always walking some weird barrier between not being authentically Algerian and not really being French. He dies very tragically in a car accident in 1960. Hot rod sports car, tire blows out, hits a tree. Terrible end to his life early. He was just getting back rolling with writing again. He went through a downtime, and then boom, he's back, and we lose him. Winner of the Nobel Prize, I believe at the time he won it, he was the second youngest person to win it. The Nobel acceptance speech that Camus gave, always with people that read them, ranks right up there with some of the most important speeches. So when he had the largest intellectual spotlight at the time, the Nobel Prize, he came through with this incredible acceptance speech. He wrote 3 novels, The Stranger, The Plague, and The Fall, in that order. They're on the shorter side. He wrote lots of short stories. Some of those are incredibly good. Some of those are okay. Plays, he wrote a number of plays. Again, some of the plays are just incredible. MacMurray College put on a production of Cross Purposes or The Misunderstanding. It can be titled either way. Fantastic play. He was a journalist his entire life. So early on he was a journalist, and during the war, his major contribution to France during the war was editing an underground newspaper that was illegal. He wrote up to 5 editorials a week for that paper while he's writing novels that launch him into the upper stratosphere of qualitative writers in the world. So he's a remarkable person. Married twice. His second wife is from Oran, so he has that connection again. He lived in Oran, he had an apartment with her in Oran that was very close to her family. And he did come to the United States once. Columbia University brought him in 1946. Interestingly enough, he was detained for about 8 hours on the direct order of Hoover because they didn't know enough about him yet, and they didn't know if they wanted him in the States. So he had an interesting entrance into the States. The location and the characters of the text that you might read, this plague text, it's in Oran, Algeria. He has really, really strong ties to Algeria. The vast majority of his works are written about North Africa. So he places almost everything that he writes in the North African context and writes at least twice, if not 3 times, about Oran. The characters are very important. Each one is very intentional. He just doesn't move the story along by having a character. They all have a lot of meaning. Every time I've taken a very close look at a character in any of Camus' work, it's been worth it because the name usually means something. There's usually some connection to the classical world, to French politics, to something with the way he names this person. They all have very heavy intentionality to them. So some of them are people he knew. Some of them are people that you would know if you lived in France, for instance, in the 1940s. So others are sort of snippets of people that are placed in there as stock pieces. And there are parts of himself in just about every character that he writes, especially in these main texts, these three novels. Um, don't think that Camus is one person. You see a lot of people fall into that trap when they're reading The Plague. He's obviously Dr. Ryu. He's the cold, calculating, sit back one. Or he's obviously Rambert, if you know a little bit about his background. He's not. He's part of it. Part of him's in Rambert. Part of him is in Ryu, but not all of it. So he spreads himself around all of these characters that he writes about. Some themes that are worth exploring in The Plague, if you're going to read it. I really think it's important to understand this leveling effect that happens in The Plague. The Plague is a really powerful literary device to bring everybody down to the same level. So a lot of social and economic advantages get stripped away by Plague, and all people are under the same indictment. And Camus often calls it an indictment. You're under a death sentence, and it could happen. Plague is just math, right? It's biology and math coming together to see if you acquire plague or not, and then survive plague or not. And that makes everybody equal. So it's a powerful, powerful stage to set these characters on that he does. Because remember, his background is theater, and it's always there. So he sets these characters on this stage in Oran, and away they go, encountering these different difficulties and working his way through very complex, not necessarily complex, but very interesting philosophical questions. Pay attention to the weather. Camus is driven by the idea of light and darkness, so when he calls special attention to light or special attention to darkness, natural light and darkness, it's very important. Weather is very important for Camus. When you're reading the sermons of Father Panlot, pay attention to the weather changes between the two. It's fascinating. Underrepresented populations are a problem for Camus. Long-standing problem in Camus of the underrepresentation of women in his work. And the Arab population, of course, is not illuminated at all in The Plague. I think there's one time where they walk through an Arab section of Oran, make note of it, and it's about a 60-40 split. About 60% of the population are Arab at the time this text would have been written. And finally, pay attention to the accounting of time. It starts out with human time, and it ends up with natural time. So we get hours and days and weeks and precise notions of April 15th, 3 o'clock. As the plague moves on, as the texts move on, it just becomes autumn. It just becomes winter. Nature takes over the metaphysical accounting of time, and human time is just not used anymore. It had very, very broad critical reception, very powerful critical reception, so it's been very well received over the years. If you are interested in Camus' life, I recommend this text, Oliver Todd's Camus. It's very accessible. It's not terribly big, but it's very well written to get a handle on Camus' life. And if you're interested in reading more Camus, here's a plan. Read this. Read The Stranger. So it's one of his, the most widely read text of Camus. Read The Stranger, and then pick up this text, the Merceau Investigation by Camille Dowd. I'm going to load a PowerPoint that'll have these on it because it's reversed, I know. But if you read The Stranger, so read The Plague. Then if you want more, read The Stranger, and then read this text. And I promise you, these two texts as a pair, you will enjoy greatly during this time of isolation. I hope you all remain safe. And I want to thank MacMurray College for giving us this opportunity to do this.